The call came on a Wednesday evening just after sunset while I was rinsing a coffee mug I didn't remember pouring. My phone buzzed against the counter screen, lighting up with my mother's name. I let it vibrate twice before answering, already feeling that familiar tightening in my chest. The sound that comes when something small is about to turn into something permanent. "You need to come home this weekend," she said. No greeting, no question. "We're having a family dinner." I glanced at the calendar taped to the fridge. Nothing written on it. That alone should have warned me. "What's the occasion?" I asked. A pause, short, practiced. "It's important." Important had always meant planned without me. I agreed anyway. That was still my habit then, saying yes before I understood the cost. I drove up on Saturday afternoon, the sky heavy with low winter clouds, the kind that presses everything down. My parents' house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in suburban Connecticut, trimmed hedges, symmetrical windows, the illusion of balance. I parked where I always did, 2 houses down, because my father liked the driveway clear. Inside, the smell of roasted meat and something sweet filled the air. Holiday adjacent. Not a holiday, but close enough to borrow its weight. My older sister Lauren stood at the kitchen island with a glass of wine, laughing too loudly at something my brother-in-law had said. My father sat at the head of the table, jacket still on, like he was about to leave at any moment. My mother moved between rooms, straightening things that were already straight. "Hey," Lauren said when she saw me smile, sharp but controlled. "You made it." I nodded. "You said it was important." She exchanged a look with my father. That was the first sign. The way information moved around me instead of through me. Dinner started normally enough. Talk about traffic, about the neighbors, about how cold it had been lately. My father asked about my job the way he always did, vaguely, as if the details might bore him. "You still at that firm?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Same position." He grunted. "Good. Stability matters." Lauren smiled into her glass. Halfway through the meal, my father set his fork down. The sound was deliberate. My mother froze with her napkin in her hands. "We need to talk about some decisions," he said. I felt it then, that internal drop, like missing a step in the dark. "What kind of decisions?" I asked. "Family decisions," he said, "about the future." Lauren leaned back in her chair, suddenly relaxed. That was the second sign. My father continued, voice calm, controlled. "Your mother and I have been working with our attorney, updating documents, making sure things are in order." I waited. I had learned not to interrupt. Silence made people careless. "We've decided to streamline," he said. "Simplify. Lauren will be taking on more responsibility, financially, logistically." My mother finally looked at me. Her eyes flicked away almost immediately. "And me?" I asked. My father waved a hand, dismissive. "You're independent. You always have been." That word, independent. It sounded like praise, but it landed like exile. Lauren spoke up then. "It just makes sense. You don't really need to be involved. You have your own life." I stared at her. Involved in what? Another pause, longer this time. "The estate," my father said, "the business interests, the planning." I felt my jaw tighten. I didn't know we were having this conversation tonight. "It's not a conversation," he said. "It's an update." There it was, the shift. From family to administration. "So you're saying I'm being removed?" I said. "No," my mother said quickly. "Not removed. Just not included." I almost laughed at the precision of that cruelty. Lauren leaned forward. "Don't take this personally. Dad just thinks you're better off without the stress." I looked at my father. "Is that what you think?" He met my gaze. For a moment, something flickered there. Then it hardened. "You've never really been part of the core," he said. "You're too separate. This is practical." Practical. Another word they like to use when something hurt. I pushed my chair back slowly. The sound scraped against the floor, loud in the quiet room. "So this dinner," I said, "was to tell me after the fact." My father nodded. "We didn't want drama." I stood up. My hands were steady. That surprised me. "I need to understand exactly what's changed," I said. Lauren sighed. "Why do you always make things difficult?" That was the third sign, the one that finally made it clear. I wasn't difficult. I was inconvenient. "I'll be in touch," I said. My father frowned. "There's nothing to discuss." I looked at him, then really looked. The man who had always decided where I fit, how much space I took up. "We'll see," I said. I didn't slam the door when I left. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for explanations or apologies. I just walked out into the cold, my breath visible in the air, and sat in my car until my hands stopped shaking. At the time, I thought that dinner was the betrayal. I was wrong. It was only the opening move, and I hadn't even seen the board yet. I didn't call anyone on the drive home. That was new for me. Normally, after a family dinner that left a bruise, I would replay it with a friend, soften the edges, explain everyone's intentions until the story no longer hurt. This time, I let the silence sit in the car with me. The hum of the tires on the highway felt steadier than any reassurance I could have borrowed. By the time I reached my apartment, it was dark. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood in the entryway and listened to the quiet, the kind that belongs to a place where no one is waiting for you to explain yourself. I kept hearing my father's voice. "You've never really been part of the core." It wasn't shouted. It hadn't needed to be. He said it the way someone states a fact they believe has already been proven. The next morning, I woke up with a headache and a strange sense of urgency, like I had forgotten something important. It followed me through the shower, through coffee, through answering emails at work. I kept checking my phone, half expecting a message that would clarify everything. One that would say there had been a misunderstanding. Nothing came. At lunch, I opened my banking app without thinking, scrolling through transactions the way people do when they're bored. Then I stopped. There were transfers I didn't recognize, small ones, regular ones, labeled in ways that looked familiar enough to pass without notice. Household support, administrative reimbursement, estate prep. My stomach tightened. I pulled up older statements, then older ones. The pattern went back years. Not large amounts, not dramatic, just enough to add up, enough to suggest intention. I closed the app and stared at my desk. That evening, I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, too fast. "Hi," she said. Her voice was careful, controlled. "I need to ask you something," I said. She exhaled softly. "Okay. Have you been moving money through my accounts?" Silence. Not the startled kind, the calculating kind. "It was easier that way," she said finally. "You weren't using it." My grip tightened on the phone. "Easier for whom?" "For the family," she said. "Your father didn't want to complicate things." By using my name, I asked. "It was temporary," she said quickly, "just while we sorted things out." I laughed once, short and sharp. "Sorted what out?" "The transition," she said. "Lauren stepping up, the business restructuring." So while I was being told I was independent, I said my independence was being managed. "That's not fair," she said. "It's accurate," I replied. She started to cry then, the way she always did when cornered by facts. Soft, apologetic, designed to redirect. "You don't understand how much pressure your father is under," she said. "We were trying to protect everyone." "Who was protecting me?" I asked. She didn't answer. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. I searched my email for old attachments. Legal language I had skimmed years ago. Documents signed during holidays, birthdays, moments when I had trusted the room. I found them. Power of attorney. Limited but active. Authorization clauses. Access permissions that allowed my accounts to be used for family purposes under certain conditions. Conditions I had never been told were ongoing. I felt cold, not angry cold. This wasn't an emotional betrayal. It was procedural. The next day, I took a personal day from work and made an appointment with an attorney. Not the family one. Someone recommended by a colleague who didn't know my parents' names. Her office was small and quiet. She listened without interrupting, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad. When I finished, she looked up at me. "You weren't excluded because you were uninvolved," she said. "You were excluded because you were useful." That sentence settled into me like a weight finding its place. "What do?" I asked. "You stop being convenient," she said, "legally." She explained my options: revoking authorizations, freezing access, creating separation where none had been allowed to exist. "It will feel drastic," she said, "to them." I nodded. "I'm not interested in how it feels to them." That night, Lauren texted me. "Don't overreact. Dad's just trying to keep things clean." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "Clean for who?" She didn't answer. The paperwork took a week. Quiet work. Signatures, copies, notifications sent by registered mail. I didn't announce any of it. I didn't warn anyone. I wanted to see what happened when the system noticed my absence. The reaction came faster than I expected. My father called, straight to the point. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Untangling," I said. "You're destabilizing things," he said. "I was never stable," I replied. "I was managed." His voice sharpened. "You're making this adversarial." "No," I said, "I'm making it clear." There was a pause, then colder, "You're forcing our hand." That was when I understood. This was bigger than hurt feelings, bigger than favoritism. I wasn't just losing my place. I was threatening theirs. When the call ended, I sat in the quiet again. This time it didn't feel empty. It felt alert. I opened a new folder on my laptop and labeled it with a single word: Records. I didn't know yet what I would need them for. I only knew that the story my family told about me was starting to crack. And when it broke, I intended to be ready. The first thing that disappeared was courtesy. It happened quietly, the way small privileges vanish before you realize they were ever there. My mother stopped answering calls and switched to texts that took hours, sometimes days, to arrive. My father communicated only through short-clipped emails, each one written like a memo. Lauren stopped pretending altogether. She showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Thursday evening, her heels loud on the hallway tile, her knock sharp and impatient. "You blindsided us," she said the moment I opened the door. I didn't invite her in. I leaned against the frame and waited. "You revoked access without warning," she continued. "Dad had meetings, transfers scheduled. You made him look incompetent." I studied her face, the tension around her mouth, the way her eyes kept flicking past me into the apartment, as if assessing what else I might be hiding. "I revoked access to my accounts," I said. "That's not a blindside, that's ownership." "You're acting like a victim," she snapped. I smiled faintly. "No, I'm acting like an adult." Her jaw tightened. "You think you're smarter than everyone else now?" "I think I finally read what I signed," I said. That landed. She exhaled sharply, changing tactics. "You're overcomplicating this. Dad is trying to protect the family, the business. You know how fragile things are right now." I nodded. "That explains the secrecy. It doesn't justify it." She crossed her arms. "What do you want?" The question was almost sincere. "I want my name removed from anything I didn't consent to," I said. "And I want the truth documented." She laughed once, humorless. "You're going to burn bridges over paperwork?" "No," I said. "I'm refusing to be erased by it." Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then back at me. "You're making enemies," she said. I met her gaze. I already had them. She left without saying goodbye. That night I slept poorly. Not because I was unsure, but because I could feel the shift, the way the ground moves just before something collapses. My family wasn't reacting emotionally anymore. They were reacting strategically. The next week I was copied on an email thread I wasn't meant to see. It came from an old assistant in my father's office, forwarded accidentally or deliberately, I couldn't tell. The subject line was bland, internal clarification. The message outlined concerns about my recent behavior, suggested that I had become unpredictable, emotionally compromised, a potential liability. My name appeared again and again attached to phrases like risk mitigation and containment. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to my attorney. "This," she said when we spoke later, "is where it turns." "How so?" I asked. "They're laying groundwork," she said. "If they can frame you as unstable, they can justify cutting you out completely, legally." I felt a slow burn in my chest, not anger, recognition. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We let them talk," she said, "and we document everything." At work, I found it harder to focus. Not because of the situation itself, but because of how much mental space it had been taking without my consent. I started staying later, not out of necessity, but because the structure helped. Fluorescent lights, clear expectations, no subtext. One evening as I was packing up, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, almost. "This is Michael Harris," the voice said when I answered. "Your parents' attorney." I closed my eyes. "What can I do for you?" "We're hoping to resolve this amicably," he said. His tone was smooth, practiced. "There's concern that you may not fully understand the implications of your recent actions." "I understand them," I said. "There's a perception," he continued, "that you're acting out of emotional distress." I let the silence stretch. "I'm acting out of informed consent," I said finally. "Which part concerns you?" He cleared his throat. "We'd like to propose a meeting, with all parties present." "No," I said. Another pause. "You're declining dialogue." "I'm declining pressure," I replied. "Put everything in writing." He sighed softly. "That may escalate things." "I didn't start the escalation," I said. "I noticed it." The call ended shortly after. That night, I went through my records again. Slowly, methodically. I traced every authorization, every signature, every moment where trust had been used as leverage. I found something else. A clause buried deep in an old document. Language that tied my access to certain family-held assets to ongoing cooperation. Vague, flexible, dangerous. I stared at the screen for a long time. They hadn't just been using my accounts. They had been keeping me compliant. The realization settled heavily, but it also clarified something I had been avoiding. This wasn't about being left out of a will. This was about control. And control, once exposed, does not loosen willingly. The next morning, I made another appointment with my attorney. When I walked into her office, I felt different. Not shaken, focused. I think they're preparing to cut me off completely, I said. She nodded. I agree. So what's the next move, I asked. She leaned back in her chair. We stop reacting, and we prepare to act. I thought of the dinner, the quiet exclusions, the way my independence had been praised only when it was useful. I'm ready, I said. She smiled slightly. Good. Because once you take the next step, there's no going back. I didn't hesitate. Then let's make it count. As I left her office, my phone buzzed again. A message from my mother. Please stop this, you're tearing the family apart. I typed a reply, then erased it. Instead, I turned the phone off and stepped into the cold air outside. For the first time, the fear I had been carrying gave way to something steadier. Resolve. They had spent years deciding for me. Now it was my turn. And they had no idea how much I already knew. The first formal notice arrived by certified mail on a Monday morning. I recognized the envelope before I opened it. Thick paper, return address printed instead of handwritten, authority without warmth. I let it sit on the kitchen counter while I made coffee, the kettle screaming louder than necessary. I wanted my hands steady when I read it. It was a demand letter, polite, controlled, framed as concern. It stated that my recent actions had caused material disruption to family operations, and that continued interference could result in legal remedies. There was a paragraph suggesting mediation, another implying consequences if I refused. I read it once, then again. Not a single line addressed what they had done, only what I had stopped allowing. I didn't respond. That silence did what it always does. It invited escalation. By Wednesday, my work email received a message from a consultant I vaguely recognized. Someone my father had hired years ago. The subject line read, clarification of role. The email suggested that my current employment might conflict with certain fiduciary expectations related to my family's holdings. It wasn't a threat. It was worse. It was a suggestion designed to make me doubt my footing. I forwarded it to my attorney with a single line. They're reaching outward now. She called me within the hour. That's sloppy, she said, and useful. How so, I asked. They're trying to create pressure points, she said, which means the internal ones aren't working. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the street below. People walking dogs. Someone jogging. Ordinary life continuing without any awareness of the quiet war happening in my inbox. What should I do, I asked. Nothing yet, she said. But start documenting external interference. This changes the scope. That afternoon, my mother showed up at my apartment. She hadn't called. She hadn't texted. She stood in the hallway clutching her purse like a shield. I need to talk to you, she said. I stepped aside and let her in. She looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was finally seeing her without the role she played. This has gone too far, she said, sitting on the edge of the couch. Your father is beside himself. I sat across from her. I didn't cause this. You're provoking him, she said. You know how he reacts when he feels cornered. I nodded. I do. That's why I stopped standing in corners. Her eyes filled. Why are you doing this? The question wasn't curious. It was desperate. Because I didn't consent, I said. And because no one thought they needed to ask. She shook her head. Families don't work like that. I leaned forward. Healthy ones do. She flinched. Lauren is overwhelmed, she continued. The business is unstable. This is the worst possible time. I almost smiled. The timing was always wrong when power was being questioned. So you need me to step back, I said. Again, she hesitated, just until things calmed down. And then I asked. She didn't answer. That was the moment something inside me finally settled. Not anger, acceptance. I love you, I said, but I won't disappear to make this easier. She cried then, quietly. Not theatrically. For a moment, I felt the old pull to fix it, to smooth things over, to take responsibility for everyone's comfort. I stayed seated. When she left, she hugged me too tightly and whispered, "Please don't do anything you can't undo." I didn't correct her, because what I was doing was already irreversible. 2 days later, my attorney sent me a draft. It was a formal notice of revocation and clarification, not just of financial authorizations, but of any implied obligations, informal roles, or fiduciary expectations tied to my name. It referenced specific statutes, precedents, language that closed doors cleanly. Reading it felt like standing upright after years of leaning. We sent it to every relevant party: my parents, Lauren, their attorney, the consultant who had emailed my workplace. The response was immediate. My father called over and over. I didn't answer. Lauren left a voicemail, her voice shaking with fury. "You're blowing this up on purpose." Their attorney emailed asking for reconsideration, mediation, compromise. Judith replied for me. My client is acting within her rights. Direct further correspondence through this office. After that, the tone changed. The warmth disappeared completely. What replaced it was cold efficiency. Documents were filed, positions clarified, lines drawn. And in the middle of it all, something unexpected happened. An email arrived from my grandmother's former accountant. Retired. Long removed from family politics. He had heard somehow. The message was brief. If you need historical records, I kept copies. I stared at the screen. This wasn't just about the present anymore. There was a past they hadn't expected me to access. I forwarded the email to my attorney. Her reply came back fast. This could change everything. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind was finally moving forward instead of in circles. They had always counted on my restraint, my loyalty, my silence. They had mistaken those things for weakness. What they hadn't accounted for was this. Once someone realizes they were controlled, they don't ask for permission to stop. They take notes. And they prepare. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. They had underestimated how carefully I had been paying attention all these years. And soon, they were going to feel it. The accountant's office sat above a bakery that smelled like sugar and heat, the kind of place people didn't notice unless they were looking for it. I arrived early and waited on a wooden bench by the window, watching customers come and go with paper bags folded under their arms. Ordinary transactions, clear exchanges, nothing hidden. That mattered more to me than it should have. When he arrived, he walked slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned the cost of rushing. Gray hair, neat coat, a leather briefcase worn soft at the corners. "You look like your grandmother," he said after we shook hands, not as a compliment, as an observation. We sat across from each other in a small office that smelled faintly of old paper. He opened the briefcase and removed a folder thicker than I expected. "I wasn't sure you'd ever ask," he said, "but I'm not surprised you did." "I didn't know there was anything to ask for," I said. He smiled gently. "That's how it works." He laid the documents out slowly. Ledgers, correspondence, copies of filings that predated my involvement in anything official. My name appeared more often than I remembered, sometimes as a beneficiary, sometimes as a contingency. "She was methodical," he said, tapping the papers. "Your grandmother, she trusted your father to manage. She trusted you to notice." My throat tightened. "Notice what? That trust is only safe when it's visible," he said. "She built redundancies, quiet ones." I scanned the pages. There it was. A clause buried deep in an old trust addendum. Language that shifted authority under specific conditions. Conditions tied not to age or status but to conduct. "What does this mean?" I asked. He met my eyes. "It means your exclusion may have triggered a review," she anticipated. I felt my pulse quicken, but my voice stayed level. "A review by whom?" "By whoever was paying attention," he said. We didn't say anything for a moment. "So if my father restructured without transparency," I said slowly, "he may have breached—" "Not may," he said, "did." I closed my eyes briefly. This wasn't revenge, this was consequence. I left the office with copies secured in a folder under my arm and a strange sense of calm settling over me. Not triumph, orientation, like finding north after years of drifting. When I called my attorney, she didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she said, "This reframes everything." How, I asked. "It shifts you from reactive to central," she said, "and it exposes motive." We moved quickly after that. Not loudly, precisely. She filed a notice of inquiry with the trust administrator. A formal request for review based on exclusionary actions and misrepresentation. The language was neutral. The implication was not. The response came within 48 hours. A request for clarification. Then another. Then silence. That silence didn't last. Lauren called me late one night. Her voice was tight, brittle. "What did you do?" she asked. I asked questions, I said. "You're putting everything at risk," she snapped. "Dad is furious." "I imagine," I said. "He says you're trying to punish him." I thought about the bakery, the ledgers, the way my grandmother's handwriting curved deliberately around important numbers. "No," I said, "I'm letting the structure respond." She laughed sharp and unsteady. "You always talk like this is some experiment." "It is," I said, "just not mine." There was a pause, then quieter. "If this blows back on us." "It won't," I said, "if things were done cleanly." She hung up. The trust administrator requested a meeting. My attorney attended with me. We sat across from two people who had no emotional investment in my family's story, only in compliance. They asked about timing, about access, about who had been informed and when. I answered carefully, honestly. When it was over, one of them nodded. There are discrepancies, she said. We'll be conducting a full audit. My father found out that same afternoon. This time he didn't call. He emailed. A long message, defensive, indignant, accusatory. You are overstepping. This is not what your grandmother intended. You are misusing technicalities to hurt your own family. I read it once. Then I forwarded it to my attorney and archived it. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat on the floor with the folder open in front of me. Papers spread out like a map of a life I had lived inside without ever being shown the legend. I wasn't angry. I was clear. They had treated my silence as consent, my distance as disinterest, my independence as expendability. They had made a mistake, not in underestimating me, in forgetting who taught me how to endure quietly. My grandmother hadn't raised her voice either. She had built systems, and now one of them was waking up. As I turned off the light and lay back on the floor staring at the ceiling, I realized something that shifted the weight of everything. I didn't need to confront anyone. I didn't need to explain myself. The structure would do it for me. And when it finished, there would be no argument left to have. Only outcomes, and they were already in motion. The audit didn't announce itself. It moved the way real scrutiny always does, quietly, methodically, without emotion. Requests for records, timelines, clarifications sent to offices that had grown used to operating on assumption instead of proof. My father called it harassment. The trust administrator called it procedure. I called it inevitable. For the first time since that dinner, I wasn't the one reacting. I was waiting. Weeks passed. At work, I focused on deliverables and deadlines, the comfort of systems that did what they said they would. At night, I slept better than I had in years. Something about knowing the truth was being handled by people who didn't care who my father was, loosened a knot in my chest I hadn't realized was permanent. Lauren tried a different approach. She sent an email not angry this time, but familiar, casual, almost warm. Can we talk without lawyers? Just us. I read it twice before replying. If you have something factual to share, put it in writing. She didn't respond. Instead, my mother called. Her voice was thin, brittle at the edges. They're asking questions, she said, about things that go back decades. That's how audits work, I replied. You could stop this, she said. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. I leaned back against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes. It wasn't. She inhaled sharply. Do you want your father humiliated? I don't want him protected from consequences, I said. There's a difference. She went quiet. They're talking about intent now, she said finally. About whether decisions were made in good faith. I felt something settle into place. Were they? She didn't answer. That was the moment I understood that my mother had known more than she admitted. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to stay quiet. Enough to benefit. The next notice arrived by courier, a formal update from the trust administrator. Preliminary findings indicated potential breaches of fiduciary duty. Potential. That word carried weight. My attorney called me that afternoon. This is no longer just a review, she said. It's moving toward enforcement. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. What does that mean for me? It means your position strengthens, she said. And theirs narrows. The pressure escalated fast after that. My father's attorney requested an emergency meeting. Lauren sent 3 messages in one night, each more frantic than the last. My mother left a voicemail asking me to please remember that family is all we have. I saved the message. I didn't respond. At work, my supervisor pulled me aside after a meeting. Everything okay? She asked gently. Yes, I said, and for once it was true. The audit report was scheduled to be finalized within the month. I didn't know what the outcome would be. I didn't speculate. I had learned that expectation was just another way to give power away. Then something unexpected happened. My father showed up at my apartment. No call, no warning, just the sound of a knock slower than Lauren's had been heavier. I opened the door and stepped back without speaking. He stood there, coat buttoned, wrong eyes tired, older than I remembered, or maybe just exposed. You've made your point, he said. I waited. This has gone far enough, he continued. You've disrupted everything. I didn't disrupt it, I said. I revealed it. He scoffed. You think this makes you righteous? I think it makes me accurate, I replied. He stepped inside uninvited and looked around, taking in the smallness of my space, the simplicity. I wondered what he saw. Failure, freedom. You always wanted distance, he said. Now you have it. I met his gaze. You decided that long before I did. He clenched his jaw. You could end this today. How, I asked. By withdrawing your inquiry, he said. By telling them you were confused. And if I don't, I asked. His voice dropped. Then you force a reckoning, none of us walk away from clean. I considered that. You already forced it, I said. I just stopped pretending it wasn't happening. He looked at me, then really looked. For a moment, I thought I saw fear, not of losing money or status, but of being seen clearly. You don't understand what you're destroying, he said. I nodded slowly. You're right, I understand what I'm preserving. He left without another word. That night I didn't sleep. Not because I doubted myself, but because I finally understood the scale of what was unfolding. This wasn't about inheritance or favoritism anymore. It was about exposure. The audit wasn't going to punish him the way he feared. It was going to document him. And documentation lasts. The final report arrived on a Friday morning. I read it alone at my kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside me. The language was careful, measured, unemotional. Findings included failure to disclose material changes, improper reallocation of authority, and exclusion of a named party without sufficient cause. Remedial actions were recommended. Oversight reassigned. Authority redistributed. Transparency enforced. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I sat back and let the weight of it settle. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Lauren, what did you do? I didn't answer. My mother followed. This is destroying us. I turned the phone face down. An hour later, my attorney called. It's done, she said. You're protected, and you're positioned. For what I asked. For whatever you choose next, she said. I looked around my apartment, the quiet, the space. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something I had to negotiate. It felt like something I could decide. And that was when I realized the real shift hadn't happened in the trust or the records or the authority. It had happened in me. They could no longer threaten me with exclusion, because I had already left. And what was coming next wouldn't be about retaliation. It would be about reclamation. On my terms, power doesn't disappear when it's taken away. It relocates. In the weeks after the audit findings were released, my family went quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. Not strategic silence, not punishment. This was the silence of people recalculating their footing after the floor shifts. I didn't feel it. Lauren stopped messaging altogether. My mother sent one brief note asking if I was eating well. My father didn't reach out at all. I suspected he was busy explaining himself to people who didn't care about his intentions, only his documentation. I focused on practical matters. First, I closed accounts that had ever been used as shared conduits. I opened new ones with clean histories and single points of authorization. I changed passwords, security questions, recovery emails. It felt less like paranoia and more like hygiene. Then I addressed housing. The apartment I'd been renting had always been framed as temporary, a placeholder, something to endure until I figured things out. That narrative had served them well. It kept me movable. I didn't renew the lease. Instead, I found a small townhouse on the edge of town. Nothing impressive, no symbolic victory, just quiet rooms, clean lines, and a sense of permanence I hadn't allowed myself before. I signed the papers alone. When the keys landed in my palm, I noticed how little my hands shook. That felt like progress. At work, my supervisor called me into her office. I want to check in, she said. There's been some outreach. I nodded. From my family. She raised an eyebrow. Indirectly. Questions about your availability, your stability. I met her gaze, and I told them your performance speaks for itself, she said. But I wanted you to know. Thank you, I said. She hesitated. You don't owe anyone an explanation here. I know, I replied, and I meant it. That night, I unpacked slowly. I placed books on shelves, clothes in drawers. Each object found a place without commentary or judgment. No one watched. No one approved. I slept deeply for the first time in months. The next development arrived by registered mail, a revised proposal from the trust administrator. The audit had triggered structural changes, oversight committees, new reporting requirements, redistribution of authority, and one unexpected addition, a provision restoring my role as a named participant in future decisions contingent not on family approval, but on procedural compliance. I read it twice. This wasn't reconciliation, it was correction. I forwarded the document to my attorney. Her response was brief. This gives you leverage. Use it carefully. I considered that. Leverage had always been something my family wielded without naming. Emotional leverage, financial leverage, access leveraged against compliance. I didn't want to trade places with them, so I declined the restored role, politely, formally, in writing. Instead, I requested a buyout of my indirect interests, calculated according to the trust's own valuation metrics. The administrator responded within days. Your request is reasonable. When Lauren found out, she called me in a panic. You're walking away from everything, she said. I'm exiting cleanly, I replied. You're giving up influence, she said. I smiled faintly. I'm reclaiming autonomy. You don't understand, she insisted. Dad is barely holding it together. This could break him. I paused. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully. Lauren, I said, if someone's stability depends on controlling others, it was never stable. She was quiet. You always talk like this is about principles, she said. But it's personal. It became personal when my consent stopped mattering, I replied. She exhaled sharply. So that's it? Yes, I said. That's it. She hung up without saying goodbye. The buyout negotiations moved quickly after that. Numbers, terms, timelines, no drama, no apologies, just execution. When the funds transferred, I stared at the confirmation screen longer than I expected. Not because of the amount, but because of what it represented. Finality. I didn't celebrate. I paid off debts I hadn't realized I carried. I funded accounts with names like emergency and future. I invested conservatively. I made decisions that assumed no one would save me if things went wrong. That felt like freedom. My mother came by the townhouse once. She stood in the doorway, looking around as if she were trying to understand the shape of my life without her influence. It's nice, she said. It's enough, I replied. She nodded. Your father says you're being stubborn. I smiled. He taught me well. She sighed. He doesn't know how to talk to you anymore. I'm not sure he ever did, I said gently. She looked at me for a long moment. Do you miss us? The question surprised me. I miss who I thought we were, I said. Not what we required each other to be. She wiped her eyes and left shortly after. The final step came quietly. I updated my will. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted clarity. I named beneficiaries who knew my middle name. I included instructions that reflected my values, not my obligations. I signed it without witnesses who shared my blood. As I placed the document in the safe, I felt something release inside me. Not anger, not sadness. Relief. They could no longer threaten me with loss, because I had already chosen what to keep and what to leave behind. What I didn't know yet was that my family wasn't finished reacting. They were finished assuming, and that made all the difference. The reckoning ahead wouldn't be loud, but it would be unmistakable. Because for the first time, I wasn't just stepping out of their control. I was building something they could no longer touch. What followed autonomy was something I hadn't prepared for. Visibility. When you step out of the system quietly, people assume you've vanished. When you do it cleanly with paperwork and consequence, they start looking for you again. The first call came from someone I didn't recognize, a board member adjacent to one of my father's former ventures. He spoke carefully as if the words were walking on ice. I hope I'm not overstepping, he said. But your name came up in a review. Mine tends to do that lately, I replied. He cleared his throat. There's an impression you were sidelined. That's accurate, I said. And that you handled it, he added. Not a question. I didn't answer immediately. Silence has a way of inviting honesty. We're reassessing governance across several holdings, he continued. We could use someone who understands structure without needing to dominate it. I thanked him and declined. Not because the offer wasn't interesting, but because I wanted to choose my next step without reacting to theirs. The second call came a week later. This one from an executive recruiter who knew my work, not my family. She referenced a leadership role that hadn't existed until recently. A new division. A rebuild. You wouldn't be cleaning up messes, she said. You'd be designing the system. That stayed with me. Meanwhile, my family continued adjusting to a version of reality where I no longer absorbed the shock. Lauren tried once more, sending a message that read like a truce. I never meant to push you out. Things just happened. I stared at it for a long time. Things don't just happen. They are decided, repeated, defended. I replied with one sentence. I'm not interested in revisiting intent, only outcomes. She didn't respond. My father sent nothing, not even anger. I suspected he had moved into a phase of disbelief that looked like silence, the kind that waits for the world to correct itself. It didn't. At the townhouse, I settled into routines that belonged only to me. Morning walks, evenings with books I didn't feel guilty for enjoying, meals eaten slowly. I noticed how often I had rushed before, how urgency had been imposed from the outside disguised as importance. Without it, time expanded. One evening while sorting old files, I came across a notebook from years earlier, a place I had written ideas I never shared, projects I thought were impractical, notes about governance models that emphasized accountability over hierarchy. I laughed softly. I had already been imagining a different system back then. I just didn't think I was allowed to build it. The recruiter called again. This time I agreed to meet. We talked in a quiet cafe, sunlight cutting through the windows. She asked about my leadership style. I answered honestly. I don't confuse control with competence, I said. And I don't reward loyalty that requires silence. She smiled. That's refreshing. The offer came 2 weeks later. A senior role, real authority, clear boundaries, an exit clause written in plain language. I read the contract slowly, every line, every implication. Then I signed. I didn't tell my family. I didn't need to. The news traveled anyway. A congratulatory message arrived from an aunt who had never called me before. A distant cousin asked if we could catch up. People who had once assumed I was peripheral were suddenly curious. I kept my responses polite and brief. My mother learned through someone else. She called that evening. You didn't say anything, she said. I didn't hide it, I replied. There was a pause. Your father feels blindsided. I leaned against the counter and watched the lights come on across the street. He taught me how to make decisions without asking permission. She sighed. He says you're proving his fears. About what I asked. That you'd leave. I considered that. I didn't leave. I stopped waiting. She was quiet for a long time. I wish things had been different, she said finally. So do I replied. But wishing isn't repair. After the call, I sat alone in the living room and let the quiet settle. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like space. At work, the new role demanded everything I had learned the hard way. Setting boundaries, naming risks early, documenting decisions, refusing to let charisma override process. People noticed. Not because I was loud, but because things worked. One afternoon, during a meeting about governance failures in a partner organization, someone said, "We need someone neutral to oversee this." All eyes turned to me. Neutral. It struck me then how far I had traveled from being the family variable. The one adjusted around, the one excluded for convenience. Now neutrality was my strength. The final development came unexpectedly. A letter from my father, handwritten, short. I don't recognize the world anymore. I don't recognize you. Maybe that's my failure. I don't know how to fix this. I read it once, then folded it and placed it in a drawer. Not as punishment, as punctuation. Because the story he was trying to continue no longer required my participation. That night, standing in my kitchen, I realized something important. Revenge hadn't come as collapse or apology. It had come as irrelevance. Not mine. Theirs. They could no longer leverage me, narrate me, threaten me with absence. I had stepped into a life that didn't revolve around proving I deserved space. I simply took it, and the world quietly made room. The first sign that the story had shifted came from a place I didn't expect. Not my family, not work, not even the trust administrator. It came from silence that didn't chase me. For weeks after I started the new role, I waited for the familiar pull. The sense that something unresolved would reach out and drag me back into orbit. It didn't happen. Days passed without a single family crisis, without a coded message asking me to step in quietly, without the low-grade tension that had once shaped my nervous system. I realized then how much of my adulthood had been organized around anticipating their needs. Without that gravity, my life felt almost unfamiliar. At work, the responsibility was real and visible. Decisions landed on my desk because people trusted my judgment, not because my last name carried weight. When I said no, it stayed no. When I asked questions, no one flinched. Accountability moved forward instead of sideways. One afternoon, while reviewing a compliance report, I caught myself smiling at a line item that showed a potential issue resolved before it became a liability. It wasn't pride, it was recognition. This is what competence feels like when it isn't negotiated. The second sign came from Lauren. She emailed me from her personal account, not the family one. Subject line, "We need to talk." I didn't respond right away. I let the message sit for 2 days, not as punishment, but as practice. I wanted to answer from clarity, not reflex. When I did reply, it was brief. "If you have something specific, say it here." Her response came within minutes. "The company is being restructured again. Dad is stepping away completely. People are asking questions. About you." I read that slowly. "What kind of questions?" I typed. "About why you're not involved. About what happened with the trust. About why you left when things got difficult." There it was. The story was changing hands. I answered carefully. "I didn't leave. I was excluded. There's a difference." She didn't reply for several hours. When she did, the tone had shifted. "I didn't realize how much you carried until it was gone." That sentence sat with me longer than anything she had ever said. I typed, then erased, then typed again. "That doesn't mean you get it now. It just means you feel the weight." She didn't argue. Instead, she asked, "What do you want from us?" I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. I didn't want restitution or validation or even apology. I typed the truth. "I want you to stop explaining me. No spin, no justification, no silence dressed up as protection. Just stop." Her reply came a few minutes later. "I don't know if I can control that." "Then don't try," I wrote. "Just don't participate." She didn't answer after that. The third sign came from my mother. She showed up at the townhouse again, unannounced but quieter this time. No urgency in her posture, no rehearsed lines. She sat at the kitchen table and folded her hands. "I'm tired," she said. I poured her tea and sat across from her. "I didn't think it would end like this," she continued. "I don't think it's ended," I said. "I think it's just changed." She looked around the room, the clean surfaces, the absence of inherited furniture. "You built something separate," she said. "Yes," she swallowed. "Your father feels erased." I met her eyes. "He erased me first. He just didn't think it counted." She nodded slowly. "I know." "That was new." I stayed quiet because it felt safer, she said. I told myself it was loyalty. And now I asked. "And now I see that it was fear," she said. We sat with that. "I don't expect you to fix this," she added. "I just wanted you to know that I see it." I didn't hug her, not because I was withholding, but because this moment didn't need to be softened. Seeing is a beginning, not a repair. After she left, I stood at the window and watched her walk down the street. She looked older than she had a year ago. Not fragile, just unguarded. The fourth sign arrived at work. A partner organization flagged a governance failure tied to legacy leadership. During the meeting, someone said, "This is what happens when families confuse entitlement with stewardship." No one looked at me. They didn't need to. That sentence described my past without naming it. Later, my supervisor asked how I'd learned to navigate those dynamics so cleanly. I thought about the dinners, the documents, the quiet corrections. "I learned the hard way," I said, "by being managed instead of trusted." She nodded. "That'll do it." That night alone in the townhouse, I opened the drawer where I'd placed my father's letter. I read it again. I don't recognize the world anymore. Neither did I. But unlike him, I wasn't trying to force it back into something familiar. I placed the letter back in the drawer and closed it. The reckoning I'd feared never arrived as explosion or collapse. It arrived as redistribution of effort, of responsibility, of narrative. People adjusted, systems adapted, and the family that had once positioned itself as the center of everything found itself operating without my gravity. I wasn't missed the way I expected. I was noticed. And there is a difference between being mourned and being acknowledged. By the end of that month, I understood something essential. The loss they feared wasn't me. It was the version of the world where I absorbed cost without complaint. That version was gone. And nothing they said could bring her back. What came next wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be cruel. It would be final. Because once a system learns it can function without exploiting one of its own, it never quite forgets. And I had no intention of reminding them how to use me again. Closure is often imagined as a conversation. I learned it usually arrives as a decision made in private. The month after my mother's visit passed without incident. No calls from my father. No messages from Lauren. No sudden emergencies disguised as concern. The quiet had shifted from tactical to resigned. That was when I received the notice. A formal invitation to a shareholders' meeting tied to one of the legacy entities my family still held interests in. My name was listed not as a participant, but as a referenced party. Observational. Peripheral. It was deliberate. They weren't asking me to attend. They were reminding me I still existed in the margins of their system. I forwarded the notice to my attorney. Her reply was immediate. "They are testing whether you will re-enter voluntarily." I stared at the message longer than necessary. I had spent years being pulled into rooms where decisions were framed as inevitable, and my consent was treated as optional. I recognized the tactic immediately. I didn't decline the invitation. I countered it. Through counsel, I submitted a request for complete disengagement from all remaining entities in which my name appeared directly or indirectly. Not just financial interests, references, historical documentation, advisory acknowledgments. Everything. It was an exit request so thorough it bordered on surgical. The response took longer this time. When it came, it wasn't from my family's attorney. It was from a compliance officer. We need clarification on the scope of your request. I scheduled a call. The woman on the other end sounded tired in the way professionals do when they've inherited someone else's mess. You're asking to be removed from records that predate current governance, she said. Yes, I replied, where legally permissible. And where it isn't, she asked. I want annotations, I said. Accuracy, context. She paused. You're not asking for control. No, I said, I'm asking for separation. That's unusual, she said. I smiled to myself, so was my involvement. The call ended with a promise to review. 2 days later, my father called. His voice sounded different, less sharp, less certain. They're dismantling things, he said. I waited. You didn't need to go this far, he added. I went exactly far enough, I said. You're rewriting history, he said. No, I replied. I'm refusing to carry it. He exhaled slowly. Do you want to erase us? I closed my eyes. I want to be done, I said. There was a long silence. You think this makes you stronger, he said. I think it makes me honest, I replied. The line went dead. The final documents arrived the following week. Amended records, revised annotations, clean exits. My name appeared only where it was unavoidable. And where it did, it was framed clearly. Limited involvement. No fiduciary obligation. No operational authority. No ambiguity. I signed the acknowledgement forms with a pen that felt heavier than it should have. Not because of what I was losing, but because of what I was no longer obligated to protect. That night, I sat alone at the dining table and the townhouse papers stacked neatly beside me. The room was quiet. No background noise, no inherited expectations. I thought about how many times I had been told to wait, to be patient, to trust the process. What they had meant was wait your turn to be disappointed. I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. The last attempt came quietly. A message from Lauren sent after midnight. Dad says this is the end. I read it once. Then I replied, no, this is the boundary. She didn't respond. The following morning, I woke up early and went for a walk before work. The air was cold and clean. The street was empty. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't rehearsing anything in my head. No explanations, no defenses, no imagined confrontations. At work, I closed a major deal before noon. The room had been tense. Opinions split. The decision unpopular with one side. I made the call anyway. Afterward, a colleague leaned over and said, You don't seem afraid of being disliked. I thought about that. I'm afraid of being owned, I said, not disliked. He laughed, not fully understanding, and walked away. That evening, I returned home and opened the safe where I kept the most important documents of my adult life. My will, my financial plans, my exit confirmations. I added the final folder, family disengagement. Then I closed it. For years, I had mistaken endurance for love, silence for maturity, compliance for peace. What I had really been doing was subsidizing a system that required my diminishment to function. They called it family. I call it leverage. And leverage only works if you keep holding the weight. I didn't. The revenge they expected never came. No confrontation, no exposure, no public reckoning. Just withdrawal. Just clarity. Just a woman who stopped negotiating her worth in rooms that benefited from her absence. And when I turned off the light and went upstairs, I understood something that felt final in the best way. Nothing was chasing me anymore. And I wasn't running. People assume the hardest part is leaving. It isn't. The hardest part is living afterward without the familiar ache that once told you who you were supposed to be. After the disengagement was finalized, life didn't rush in to fill the space. It slowed. Mornings felt longer. Decisions felt quieter. There was no one to impress, no one to disappoint on a schedule I didn't choose. I hadn't realized how much of my identity had been shaped in reaction to them. Without the friction, I had to learn myself without resistance. The first real test came 3 weeks later. I was asked to speak at a regional conference. Nothing glamorous. A mid-size room, folding chairs, coffee that tasted burned. The topic was governance failures in legacy organizations and how modern compliance structures expose unspoken power dynamics. I hesitated before saying yes. Not because I was afraid of speaking, but because I knew what the subtext would be. People would hear my story even if I didn't tell it. In the end, I agreed. Not to explain myself, to mark the line. The room was mostly women, older than me, sharp-eyed, tired in a way that suggested they'd paid their dues quietly. When I stepped up to the podium, I didn't open with data. I opened with a sentence that landed harder than I expected. Most family businesses don't fail because of money. They fail because no one is allowed to say no. There was a pause, not polite, recognizing. I talked about systems that reward silence, about how loyalty is often just fear dressed in tradition, about the way roles calcify when one person absorbs the cost of everyone else's comfort. I didn't name my family. I didn't have to. Afterward, a woman in the front row waited until the room cleared. She had silver hair pulled into a clean knot and the posture of someone who had learned to take up less space than she deserved. "I was you," she said. 30 years ago, I stayed." She didn't sound bitter, just factual. "I'm glad you didn't," she added. That stayed with me. A few days later, my mother called again. This time she asked if we could walk. We met at a park halfway between our houses. Neutral ground, gravel path, bare trees. She looked smaller than I remembered, not diminished, unburdened. We walked in silence for a while. "I'm learning how much I hid," she said finally. I didn't respond right away. "I thought keeping the peace meant keeping everyone intact," she continued. "I didn't see that I was teaching you to disappear." She stopped walking. "I'm sorry," she said. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't tearful. It was the first apology that didn't ask me to fix anything afterward. I nodded, "Thank you." She asked if I would come to dinner sometime. Just her, no agenda. "I'll think about it," I said. She didn't push. That mattered. The last test came from my father. Not directly, through a third party. A colleague from my old life reached out, careful with her words. Said my father had been asking about me in rooms I no longer entered, that he spoke of me as distant, complicated, principled. None of the words were cruel. None of them were accurate. They were the vocabulary of a man trying to reframe a loss without owning it. I didn't correct the narrative. I let it collapse under its own weight. One night alone in my townhouse, I opened a box I hadn't touched since moving in. Inside were old journals, notes from my 20s, lists of goals that were always postponed, decisions delayed because they would cause tension. I read a page I'd written years ago. "I just need to get through this phase, then things will settle." I closed the journal. That phase had been my life. And it had only settled once I stopped offering myself as ballast. In the weeks that followed, I began making choices without consulting ghosts. I adjusted my work hours. I planned a trip I'd postponed for years. I rewrote my will not because I expected anything to happen, but because it felt like claiming authorship. No more defaults. One evening I stood in the kitchen, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, and realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry anymore. Not because I'd forgiven them, but because anger requires proximity, and I was no longer close. The revenge I'd imagined in my early grief had been loud, vindicating, public. What I'd chosen instead was absence. And absence, it turns out, is devastating to systems built on access. I no longer explained myself. I no longer filled gaps. I no longer softened truths for the sake of comfort. I wasn't invisible. I was unreachable. That distinction changed everything. As winter edged toward spring, invitations came that I declined without apology. Stories circulated that I didn't correct. Relationships thinned until only the honest ones remained. And in that narrowing, something solid formed. Not a replacement family, not a triumph narrative, just a life that didn't require my self-erasure to function. I knew then that the final chapter wouldn't be reconciliation. It would be recognition of what I had survived, of what I had stopped carrying, of who I had become once the pressure lifted. The ending wasn't ahead of me. It was already here, and all that remained was to name it. The last shift didn't arrive with noise. It came on a morning that looked ordinary enough to be forgettable. I woke before the alarm, the sky still pale, the kind of gray that doesn't promise anything but doesn't threaten either. I lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet of a house that belonged only to me. No inherited expectations humming in the walls, no emotional debt tucked into the corners. Just space. I made coffee and stood at the window watching a neighbor scrape frost from a windshield. Life moving forward in small, practical motions. I realized I hadn't checked my phone for hours. That used to feel reckless. Now it felt earned. There were no new messages from my family. No updates, no warnings, no emotional landmines disguised as concern. For the first time, silence didn't feel like something waiting to punish me. It felt complete. At work later that day, I signed the final set of documents that formally closed a long-running oversight project. My name went on the last page as lead decision-maker. No qualifiers, no footnotes. When I handed the file back, the clerk smiled and said, "That's it. You're clear." Clear. The word followed me all the way home. That evening I did something I'd avoided for years. I sat down and wrote a single-page statement. Not for court, not for anyone else. For myself. I wrote what I would and would not accept going forward. what access required, what silence meant now, where my responsibility ended. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't dramatic, it was precise. When I finished, I folded the page once and placed it in the safe on top of everything else. Not hidden, just contained. I thought about the version of me who used to confuse endurance with virtue, who believed that being needed was the same as being loved, who stayed quiet because she was taught that disruption was selfish. That woman had been very useful. She had paid for stability, she had absorbed blame, she had made everyone else comfortable, and she had nearly disappeared doing it. I don't hate her, I thank her. Then I let her rest. A few weeks later, my mother invited me to dinner again. This time I accepted. We ate quietly. No scripts, no attempts to repair the past with politeness. At one point, she reached across the table and said, "I didn't know how to protect you without losing him." I didn't answer right away. Finally, I said, "You weren't supposed to choose." She nodded. Tears stayed in her eyes but didn't fall. Progress doesn't always look like relief. Sometimes it looks like restraint. We said goodnight without promises. I drove home feeling steady, not reconciled, not broken, just done. I never did hear my father say the words I once needed. And that turned out not to be a tragedy, it was information. It told me who he was capable of being, and who I no longer needed him to be. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself somewhere in my story, here's what I want you to understand. Control often wears the costume of love. Silence is not peace if it costs you your voice. And loyalty that requires self-erasure is not loyalty, it's surrender. Revenge doesn't have to be loud. Justice doesn't need witnesses. And closure is not something you're given. It's something you decide. The moment you stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you, the balance shifts. Not in their favor, in yours. If this story resonated with you, take a second to like it, share it, or leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what boundary you learned too late but will never give up again. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is step back, lock the door, and choose herself. That's not abandonment. That's dignity.